The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show, the home of geek and paranormal entertainment, with me, Charles Christian, as once again we delve into the world of weirdness, folklore, urban myths, ghosts, geek culture and the occult. Naturally, we have an interview coming up on this show, but we've also got plenty of room for other items this week, starting with a story about Gwyneth Paltrow. Now, over on Twitter, the people who run the Deep Into History podcast last week ran an online survey. The question was, if you had to be a personal assistant to one of the following four people, who would be the absolute worst to work for? The four candidates were Caligula, the Roman emperor, ruled for just under 4 years. However, his reign was notorious for his cruelty, sadism, extravagance, sexual perversion and insanity, including trying to have one of his horses made a consul. For US listeners, this would be the equivalent of having a horse made vice president. The second character is Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian countess of the late 16th century who is rated as being one of the world's most prolific female serial killers, if not the most prolific female serial killer, responsible for the deaths of over 650 girls and young women, so she could bathe in the blood of virgins to retain her youthful looks. Next up, we have Genghis Khan, who, during the early years of the 13th century, created the Mongol Empire, which, at its height, occupied most of China and Central Asia. The Khan's military campaigns were notorious for their brutality. After one battle, he is said to have had over 1 million people massacred and their severed heads piled up in giant pyramids outside the gates of their conquered cities. And the final member of the notorious four is the American actress Gwyneth Paltrow, probably best known for her Oscar-winning role in Shakespeare in Love and more recently for playing Pepper Potts in the Marvel Avengers movie franchise. She is also the founder of the New Age health and lifestyle business Goop, which, among other things, has advocated vaginal steaming and the use of jade eggs in vaginal weightlifting. Nope, I have no idea what you're talking about with those. Anyway, the final results are in. In bottom place, with just 10% of the votes, was the serial killer and possible vampire Elizabeth Bathory. In third place, with 18% of the votes, was Genghis Khan. Our runner-up, with 30%, was the Emperor Caligula. And our winner, with 42% of the votes, drumroll, was Gwyneth Paltrow. Yes, the woman who unleashed this Smells Like My Vagina candles onto the world, and is now rated as twice as awful than a Mongol emperor who was responsible for the death of millions of people. Now, time for our interview, where we're going to be discussing sleep disorders, particularly sleep paralysis, which is believed to be the root of a number of paranormal and folkloric phenomena, including alien abductions, shadow people, and even clinical zoanthropy, where people genuinely believe they've turned into animals or they turn into animals at night. Evidence suggests many of the European werewolf trials of the 16th and 17th centuries were derived from a delusion we now recognise as clinical lycanthropy. Our guest is Dr. Brian Sharpless. Dr. Sharpless is currently a visiting associate professor of psychology at St. Mary's College, Maryland. He also holds a visiting research fellowship at Goldsmiths College, which is part of the University of London. Dr. Sharpless received his PhD in clinical psychology and an MA in philosophy from Pennsylvania State University. He completed his internship and postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Pennsylvania, and prior to his current position, he was on the faculty of Pennsylvania State University, Washington State University, and the American School of Professional Psychology. And just to whet your appetites further, in the course of this interview, we'll also be encountering myoclonic jerks. They're a thing, not a person, by the way. The curse of the weird gerbil. Yes, there is such a thing. And the delightful sounding exploding head syndrome, which lies at the heart of many rumours about covert government agencies trying to impose mind control. So, my great pleasure to be talking to Brian Sharpless. Now, Brian, one of the topics we're talking about is sleep paralysis. Now, it's a topic that people talk about and say, oh yeah, I've got sleep paralysis or whatever. But what exactly is it, sort of in the layman's terms?
Sure. Well, this is what happens when you're either going to sleep or waking up and you find yourself completely unable to move. So this is different from feeling tired or just feeling sluggish, and where it's hard to move. But this is a complete paralysis of the body except for your eyes, and you may have some control over your breathing, but you can't move your limbs, can't move your torso. And what goes along with that, about 80 or 90% of the time, are hallucinations. So while people are paralyzed and they're awake, and their eyes might even be able to look around the room, they're experiencing hallucinations, usually of a, shall we say, scary variety. They're not usually pleasant hallucinations.
Just before we go on to what some of these hallucinations may result in, there's another reference I've got here to exploding head syndrome, which,
yes.
which sounds very gory and a bit like that movie Scanners or something. But is that when you get, seems like a large bang goes off in your head?
Exactly. It's another strange sort of sleep experience that happens in the transitions either to or from sleep. So during a typical case of exploding head syndrome, right about when you're ready to fall asleep, you will hear this massive loud noise in your head that could sound like a bomb going off, a gunshot being fired next to your ear. I've heard it described in lots of different ways, but in general, it's a very loud, diffuse sound. People aren't hearing symphonies. People aren't hearing articulate speech. They're hearing a big burst.
Is there any suggestion what causes that?
Yes, we have about 5 different theories.
Oh, good, 5.
I think I won't
Only
go into
5.
all of them. Only 5, yeah. So we're narrowing down. That's science at work.
Yeah.
But the one that makes the most sense to me is there's this part of your brainstem called the reticular formation, and what this does as we're going to sleep, you can think of. This is a very rough analogy, but if you can imagine a computer shutting down, your brain does something similar. And so as you're going to sleep, your motor neurons are inhibited, your visual neurons are inhibited. But what we think happens during exploding head syndrome is that instead of shutting off, your auditory neurons fire all at once, which is why you get this massive blast of activity and you perceive this loud sound that isn't there. Yeah. And then you wake up in a start and you might think something bad happened.
Well, exactly. And clearly it's not, as I've heard some people suggest, it's not that you're having a stroke or anything. There's nothing sort of actually blowing up inside your head or anything.
Correct. Yes, these are harmless events. Now, I should say that if you experience significant pain during one of these episodes, you definitely want to get it checked out. It could be something a bit scarier, like a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Yeah. But in general, they're harmless. It's just how you deal with them and what you might attribute to them. So this has been worked into several conspiracy theories. You might not be shocked to learn. Anytime you have unusual experiences, people will try to explain them using the categories they have available. So some people, even if they know the term exploding head syndrome, even if they've read some of the scientific literature on it, believe that it is not a natural event and it's actually caused by nefarious government agents who are using directed energy weapons to potentially drive them mad or keep them from sleep.
Right.
So I've gotten a number of interesting calls and emails based on that, letting me know what's really going on with that. Yes.
Right. Now, how common is or uncommon is sleep paralysis? I've got some notes here, and it's saying both Kendall Jenner and Billie Eilish have been reported having it. But, out there, how common is it? Is it something that is one in 100, or can most people at some point in their life possibly expect to have it?
Yeah, looking at the data, and I was able to combine a study I did with 35 other studies to get around 36,000 people. We were able to find out that about 8% of the general population will experience it at least once in their lives, with much higher rates in college students and in psychiatric patients. The rates would be 28 and 32% respectively on that. So it's a fairly common event, and anybody could experience it, but there does seem to be a genetic predisposition. There's a particular mutation on the PER2 gene that seems to be associated with this. And, if somebody wants to experience sleep paralysis, they really should just disrupt their sleep, maybe travel across to a different continent, have really disrupted sleep, get jet lagged, and drink alcohol before bed. If you do all those things, they will make it more likely for you to actually experience sleep paralysis.
Right.
But again, these are fairly scary events, so I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah. It does explain why students suffer it then.
They wake up some days at 7, some days at noon,
Exactly.
Not great sleep, drinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a recipe for sleep paralysis.
Right. Okay, now what about then the hallucinations and consequences of it? You've said that it'll be a scary feeling waking up and finding that you can't move.
Yeah.
But you're saying that, suggesting some of the things people talk about in terms of paranormal experiences may actually be explained by sleep paralysis.
Yes, I hesitate to say that it would explain everything away, but I would argue that sleep paralysis could figure prominently in naturalistic explanations for certain paranormal events. So what will typically happen during a prototypical case of isolated sleep paralysis would be you would wake up, you would be clearly aware of the fact that you're not sleeping, and you would be able to look around the room, but you could not move. So this already would be a pretty uncanny experience and probably not that pleasant. And you're trying to, well, why can't I move? Is something wrong with me? Am I going to be permanently paralyzed? Am I dying? These are some of the thoughts people have reported. And so you're already sort of in a negatively valenced mood. And then what seems to happen is very shortly thereafter, you sense that there's something in the room with you. Kind of like if you're walking down a dark street and you feel like you're being watched, you'll get something like that. Then your brain seems to organize this. And now you're actually seeing something, possibly hearing something. And then the next step of the progression would be to actually have physical contact with this anomalous entity in the room with you. So the classic cases of sleep paralysis involve an attacker being on your chest, strangling you, just being heavy on top of you. Have you ever seen the Nightmare by Henri Fuseli, the famous painting?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, that is thought to be a visual representation of sleep paralysis, with this evil gnome sitting on the chest of this poor woman who can't do anything. Yeah.
That's the one with the horse peering out of the background, isn't it?
Yep. And in fact, this was called the original Nightmare.
Right.
Yep.
So you get that sensation, and then it leads to other ideas then.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're having a very strange hallucination that you're aware of, and you're awake when you have it, you can't write it off as a dream. So some people will put supernatural attributions onto this event, and interestingly, this seems to affect all time periods, all cultures. I was able to come up with over 100 different indigenous terms for what seems to be sleep paralysis events. So you can see ghost depression in China. You can see the Popobawa in New Guinea, which is a giant black bat. In the West, if you go to the southern U.S., in African American culture, they'll talk about the witch riding you. So evil hag on top of you, having sex with you without your wishes. And so each culture seems to put their own spin on it. And you may, in fact, be seeing things that you're primed to experience. So the causality of it is kind of interesting. Do you believe in strange things because you have a strange event you can't understand, or do you have a strange event you can't understand because you already believe strange things? So there does seem to be a cultural loading to these things, which is fascinating, and we haven't quite been able to tease out yet.
These would also, shadow people, or they would fall into that category, and some form of, as you've said, giant bats sitting on you, demons and things of that nature. What about things like alien abductions?
Yeah, I mean, if you read the first-hand descriptions of nocturnal alien abductions, they map on really well onto sleep paralysis episodes. So they start out very similar. Usually, you wake up on your back or on your stomach, and you awake and you can't move, and you hear and see strange figures. You might feel like you're being levitated vertically or horizontally, and you may experience pain. You might feel that you're being invaded in some way or probed. And in fact, there were studies that Rich McNally did at Harvard where he was able to look at a sample of people who reported alien abduction, and lo and behold, they also reported sleep paralysis experiences. He did that study with Susan Clancy. And yeah, you mentioned shadow people. I did a study recently with a Czech doctoral student, and we found that the most commonly reported figure during sleep paralysis episodes by a fairly large margin were shadow people. And a lot of people, if you're not familiar with the paranormal world, you might not even know what shadow people are. But they were by far the most common and greatly outstripped the number of people reporting aliens or vampires or any of those classic things, with the exception of ghosts. Ghosts were the number two most reported seen figures.
Yeah. Would sleep paralysis possibly be also associated with sort of out-of-body experiences, astral projection and the like?
Ooh, that's a great question. Yes, if you ask people all the things that go on during sleep paralysis, they will report things consistent with that. Some people, a minority of people, will report being able to see their body from the outside, where they're hovering above their bed looking down on their vulnerable form. So you do report that, and you don't always experience the hallucinations in your bedroom. So I worked with this one young lady who, when she was experiencing sleep paralysis, she hallucinated that she was in New York City when she was actually living in Pennsylvania at the time. And so she hallucinated an entire city around her with people that she knew. But again, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt just as real and sounded just as real as my voice does right now. So you can have things like that. Then you can have a combination. Another person reported train tracks and a train going through their bedroom during an episode of sleep paralysis.
Right.
With all the steam and the loud noises and the dust.
Yeah.
So these can be very, very vivid. And from my perspective, I don't begrudge anybody from wondering if they could have been real events. They are extraordinarily vivid and look just as real as anything in waking life.
What about REM behavioral disorder?
Ooh, that's a good one. So REM behavioral disorder is sort of the opposite of sleep paralysis. So in sleep paralysis, what you have going on are two aspects of rapid eye movement sleep while you're awake. So you have the paralysis, which is put in there presumably so we don't act out our dreams, which would be pretty dangerous. And then you've got the interesting REM dream mentation going on. So you can dream during non-REM periods, but you're most likely to have dreams during REM sleep, and they're the most vivid. So what happens in REM sleep behavior disorder is that you are having dreams and you are asleep, but you are not paralyzed. And these can be very dangerous. There are a number of case studies talking about people hurting who they're sleeping next to, because the dreams that go on during REM sleep behavior disorder are dreams of being attacked. So I saw this fascinating reproduction of a man was doing a sleep study, and they put in animations of what the gentleman was actually seeing as he was pounding at the walls and swiping in the air. And he dreamed that he was being attacked by a pterodactyl.
Right.
And so in the sleep, he's flailing about with all his might, trying to get this pterodactyl from to keep the pterodactyl from biting and clawing at him. But he's like hitting the walls. He's hitting the equipment that are on his head. It's just chaos. And if somebody is sleeping next to you during that, you will see lots of bodily injury. And I believe there was one case that a person actually killed another person during this.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're very, very scary, vivid experiences.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find fascinating about studying sleep disorders is that sleep and wakefulness are not mutually exclusive. You get all these kind of strange in-between states. And that's where we get some of the sleep disorders.
Oh, right. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, sleepwalking, for instance, is, you have someone engaging in effortful activity while they're fully asleep. They're actually a state of non-REM sleep when they're sleepwalking. We've already talked about sleep paralysis and REM behavioral disorder, which you can see you've got aspects of non-REM sleep and REM sleep going on with REM sleep behavior disorder. And then you've got a combination of REM sleep and wakefulness going on in sleep paralysis. Mm-hmm. So you've got all these strange things, which, again, because they're such strange events, they get wrapped up in myth and folklore. Yes. And you can see how people who are struggling, especially if you're in a pre-scientific world, how do you explain these things? Dreams are provocative enough, right? I always wonder, what would it be like to be a Neanderthal or early Homo sapien, and you have a dream and you fly around all these places, you might see people that are long dead. How would you make sense of it? Yeah. Would you think that maybe you're going to a spirit world? Would you think you're maybe seeing the future? I mean, it's just amazingly fun stuff to ponder.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, that. And I think we tend to forget that lots of things that we now know and understand and can explain with science, whatever, you don't have to go that far back in history to, as you say, a pre-scientific culture where it would just be mystery and just be magical. Yes.
Absolutely. And some skeptics like Thomas Hobbes have posited that a lot of early religious beliefs might have come about through dreams and strange experiences happening when we're asleep, seeing visions. So it's speculative, but it's an intriguing hypothesis. And you mentioned astral projection. That doesn't seem like much of a stretch if you've had certain vivid dreams, does it?
One of the things I've seen and referenced to is dreaming while you're awake. This is as distinct from daydreaming, which, again, is something most students will be familiar with.
Hopefully not in my classes, but yes.
Of course not in yours. No.
Dreaming while you're awake. I'm not quite sure I follow that. It's not something that I've really studied. I've certainly seen worked with lots of people with hallucinations.
I think that's what I was meaning. I've got some notes scribbled down here, and I think I've sort of slightly interpreted it incorrectly. Yes.
Gotcha.
Hallucinations then, yes.
Yeah, so hallucinations in the transitions to sleep with paralysis or without paralysis are very common. So I would bet a good chunk of your listeners, somewhere between 8 and 20%, have experienced this. It might be as simple as, you're just about ready to go to sleep and then you hear your name being called. So that could be one of the more common ones, to seeing more vivid things like spiders come crawling down the walls to right as you achieve consciousness from waking up. So sleep-related hallucinations are fairly common in the community, and in certain cases, especially if people have visual deficits, they might be more likely to have these hallucinations. So if you've got macular degeneration or other eye conditions, you might be more likely to see these hallucinations, especially in a dimly lit room.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you mentioned spiders. One of the things I've read about and I've experienced personally is a thing where you seem to see a reflection of the back of your eyeball in front of you. You can sort of see, it looks like a...
Little capillaries and stuff.
Yes. Yeah. I used to get it a lot, but I can't remember whether it was having my eyes shut and then opening them, and for just a brief moment, it was quite clearly.
Yes,
the eyeball I was seeing, as opposed to two red eyes or a giant spider about to pounce on me.
Yes, and it's lit, and you can see the floaters and all those things. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I don't know the term for it, unfortunately.
Right.
But yeah, with a subtype of sleep-related hallucinations, I don't want to bore your audience with long terms, but it's called complex nocturnal visual hallucinations. It does seem people see spiders reliably. People that aren't talking to one another, because this is a fairly rare condition, but they seem to reliably see these spiders, which again would be pretty scary and strange.
Yeah. Just on a, it's probably nothing to do with this, but I mean, what is that sensation you get just before you go to sleep, where you feel you're falling?
Yeah, that is very common. So there's a few different variations of myoclonic jerks, where sometimes right as you're about ready to fall asleep, your arm or leg will jerk up. You'll have that as well.
Yeah.
And the falling is a very common sensation, but that's not associated with sleep paralysis or REM sleep. It's a bit different.
Right.
Yeah, but they're very common things. So if you have those, if anybody's listening, you're not strange, or you might be strange. You might be strange, just not for that.
Yeah, they're going to be strange if they're listening to the show. But what about clinical lycanthropy, where people believe they've turned into animals? I believe that's been reported as well.
Yes, this is a more recent interest of mine, but I just went down sort of a wormhole of werewolf and vampire folklore and got into the scientific literature. I'm working on a project right now with a colleague of mine in the Netherlands named Jan Dirk Blom, and there is a condition called clinical zoanthropy, is the larger term, which means the belief that you've turned into an animal and acquired its characteristics. So most of your listeners, I'm sure, have heard of lycanthropy if they've watched the movies Underworld or other things like that. And clinical lycanthropy is the belief that you specifically turn into a wolf. If you believe you turn into a cat, you have clinical therianthropy.
Right.
So you can have all these different variations that are broken apart by animals. But it's a fascinating disorder. And it's a delusion, of course. Nobody believes that they're turning into this. But it's fairly rare. So my colleague, Dr. Blom, found only 52 cases reported in the scientific literature from 1852. And this really ran the gamut. Dogs were the most frequently reported animal that they were sort of changing into. Mm-hmm. Wolves were number 2, but there were some odd ones. There was somebody who believed they turned into a gerbil. So we had a were-gerbil case, and this was an American gentleman who raised gerbils as a child.
Right.
And I believe in his late 20s, he just started believing he was a gerbil, and he would crawl around under objects, under tables, and he would wiggle his nose in that cute rodentian way. There was a were snake reported in the literature, a were goose. So it doesn't always have to be wolves. And there was a sad case of a gentleman who believed he turned into a dog, and he was actually hit by a car. Ooh, while he was ambulating on all fours. So, the delusions can last hours or they could last years. And it's very interesting if you think about this in the context of the medieval beliefs in werewolves. So most historians estimate that there were no more than around 300 werewolf trials, legitimate werewolf trials in medieval Europe, primarily in France and in Germany, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
And some of the people did report this. Jean Grenier reported this consistently until his death when he was serving out his sentence at a monastery. And you also hear of people who will put on specific salves onto their body, and they will believe that this gives them the power to transform into an animal. So Gilles Garnier, who is another famous werewolf believed that he made a pact with the devil and got this green salve and rubbed the salve over his body and could turn into several animals, but decided the wolf suited him the best, and then went on a bit of a killing spree of eating and killing children. So some of the recipes for these salves have survived, and they contain some pretty interesting substances like hellebore, belladonna, things you should not put on your skin.
Yes.
They're very dangerous, and not only will they make you hallucinate, but they could kill you. So just don't try this at home, kids. But and then they had strange things. Celery was one of the ingredients in one of them. So yeah. I don't know, go to Sainsbury's and pick up some celery. I don't know what that would do, but
and turn into a weird gerbil, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. When you say the time periods, it could last for years, is this a sort of constant delusion, or is it one that you wake up and you go about your normal business and then the next night it returns, or is it that you're permanently in this?
Or the full moon, right?
The full moon, yeah. Well,
it really runs the gamut. So some people will consistently have the delusion, and some of the people, after they were, say, convicted for murder while in the form of an animal, or believing they were in the form of an animal, actually starved to death in prison because they would refuse to eat human food. Right. So some, it's consistent. Others, it's very sporadic. Some people have experienced this in the context of using certain substances, hallucinogens, and those would be fairly short-lived in most cases. But some of them can be fairly chronic, where they'll come out, they'll have some moments of lucidity where they realize they're not a dog, they're not a goose or whatever, and then they will, for whatever reason, go back into the state. So the good news is, for any of your listeners who are suffering from this, is that even though there have only been 52 documented cases, the outcome from treatment is pretty good, I gotta say.
Yeah.
What you do is you treat the primary underlying condition. So if they have an underlying mood disorder, you would treat that. If they have a psychotic disorder, you treat that. One of the more effective treatments is a combination of electroconvulsive therapy and antipsychotics. That seems to be particularly effective with these people in a small number of cases. I mean, the government isn't shelling out grant money to study people that think they're turning into wolves, but the limited case studies we have in the literature are promising in terms of treatment.
Yeah. And what about sleep paralysis? What are the treatments for that? I mean, presumably you're not going to be doing ECT with...
heavens no. No. The good news is that there are a lot of things you can do even without a doctor or psychologist's help. Simple things you can do are sleep on your side, regulate your sleep so that you go to bed and wake up at the same time every day. Don't drink before bed. Don't do coffee before bed. Don't ingest substances before bed, illegal or otherwise. And those will significantly cut down on your chances of having sleep paralysis. If you do have it in a chronic way, and about 15% of people who experience it in their lives will have it to the extent that it's a disorder, meaning it causes them problems in their lives, they're really upset about it, somewhere between 15 and 45%, depending on the study. But for those folks, you can do some behavioral interventions. So I developed a 5-session treatment for sleep paralysis based on cognitive behavioral therapy. And you can also use a meditation-based approach has been developed as well. And when you take antidepressants, one of the side effects is a reduction in REM activity. So people who go on antidepressants for anxiety or depression or other conditions will report as a side effect having less dreams. So what you could do in this case is give a low dose of an SSRI or another type of antidepressant, and you'd be using the side effect as the main effect.
I got you.
So you'd give them a low dose. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and some of the drugs used to treat narcolepsy have been effective for sleep paralysis, and that's not surprising because sleep paralysis is one of the 5 main symptoms of narcolepsy, which is a very rare condition. We're talking 1 in 2,000 people for that.
Yeah.
So there are lots of things that people can do. So if you are suffering from this, A, there is a name for it. B, it's not dangerous. And C, there's treatment options out there for you.
Right. That's fascinating. What's got you into looking into this particular psychology?
Studying weird stuff, you mean?
Yeah, studying weird stuff. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that I was always fascinated by that stuff when I was a kid. My mom got me this little book of monsters when I was probably 4 or 5, a picture book, and I always loved
bad
reading.
mom.
No, great mom. It got me liking reading. I read I read all that way more than my school books, I'll tell you that. And then, yeah, as I got older, I loved all the documentaries that would be on the Discovery Channel of finding Bigfoot and the In Search Of series.
Yeah.
And I never really lost my interest in it, but I had to do serious stuff too. So when I went to grad school, I studied anxiety disorders and psychotherapy research, but I never really lost my interest for these things. And when I went on postdoc, after I graduated, I had an opportunity to develop some new measures in an anxiety disorder sample. And one of the things I wanted to do was study sleep paralysis. So that sort of got me started in publishing scientific literature on that, and it's kind of grown from there. And the way I see it, there are lots of good people studying panic disorder and depression, but not that many people into this stuff. So it's kind of fun in a way of merging my interests in history and philosophy and anomalistic psychology, and get paid for it too.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, Brian, it's been a delight talking to you, and that was fascinating.
Yeah, been a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you ever so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Hey, you too. Thanks again. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Once again, a big thank you to Dr. Brian Sharpless. You can find all his books on Amazon, both .com and .co.uk, and on his website at www.briansharpless.com. You can also find them on the Oxford University Press website. And we'll have all the links on the podcast data on the Urban Fantasies website and on our Weird Tales Show YouTube site. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, I used to write a weekly legal column for a medical magazine, one called Doctor, which went out to general practitioners in the UK. And one of the things I did for them was a series on doctors who were put on trial for murder. And they were all men, but of course a lot of these were quite old cases when men were the only people who were allowed to practice medicine in the UK. Why are people so intrigued by it? I think in this country, probably elsewhere as well, it's because we take a bit of a morbid interest in medical murderers. It's the fascination stemming from the underlying contradiction of a person, supposedly dedicated to saving life and easing pain, devoting his skills to causing death and suffering. One of the intriguing features is that most of these murderers were killing relatives, lovers, people they held grudges against, as distinct from deliberately killing their patients. And in fact, there's only one doctor in England who's ever actually been successfully convicted for killing his patients, and that is the serial killer Dr. Harold Shipman, who is believed to have dispatched about 250 of his victims. He was found guilty and he subsequently hanged himself, committed suicide in prison. Other doctors have been accused of this, but for one reason or another were acquitted. Anyway, let's have a look at one such doctor. And this is taken from the Victorian era, and it's Dr. George Henry Lamson. Now, it's an intriguing story because it involved a bit of a red herring, which we'll explain later, a rare poison, which we'll also explain, and a last-minute intervention by the then President of the United States. Now, Dr. Lamson started out in life honourably enough. Soon after completing his medical training, he served as a volunteer with the ambulance corps in France during the Siege of Paris in 1871 and was awarded the Legion of Honour. He also served as a volunteer surgeon during the Russo-Turkish War of 1876 to 1877. That was in the Balkans, and he received decorations and awards for this. Not long afterwards, he returned to England, where he met a Miss John. She came from a wealthy background and was entitled to inherit her portion of the family estate, either on marriage or on coming of age at 21. Similar arrangements, it should be noted, also existed for her brothers and another sister. And if any of the John family were to die before such occurrences, as in inheriting their money, then their portion of the estate would be divided up by the survivors. Now, in 1878, Miss John married George Lamson, and she came into her inheritance. This was, I believe, something like £10,000, a substantial amount for the time. Anyway, with the use of the money, Dr. Lamson started a medical practice and bought himself a practice in the town of Bournemouth. I should add this was before the Married Women's Property Act, so the new Mrs. Lamson's money directly passed into the hands of her husband. However, the medical practice in Bournemouth was not a success. Failed to prosper, debts began to mount up. Various ventures tried by Dr. Lamson, including trips to America, failed. Dr. Lamson, it should be mentioned, was related to the Schuyler political family in New York, and in fact his grandfather was the brother-in-law of Alexander Hamilton. Dr. Lamson became increasingly desperate for cash and was cashing cheques that bounced and even pawned some jewellery. It should be added that it only came out later, but Dr. Lamson was addicted to morphine. Anyway, about this time, when his his practice is going rather sadly downhill, Dr. Lamson started to take an interest in the well-being of his only surviving brother-in-law. This was Percy John. He was a cripple, confined to a wheelchair by a deformed spine and paralysed legs. Although George Lamson was not his regular doctor, he frequently gave the boy medicines to ease his pain. Noticeably, other medical practitioners had not thought this was necessary. Percy had not yet come into his inheritance, as he was still only 18 and still at boarding school. This was Blenheim House near Wimbledon in South London. George Lamson frequently visited the school, and consequently Percy was not surprised to receive a letter from him towards the end of November 1881, saying he would be calling in en route to Paris. Dr. Lamson arrived at the school in the evening of December the 3rd, and with a few minutes he was drinking sherry with Percy and the school's headmaster, Mr. Bedbrook, in the headmaster's room. During the conversation, Dr. Lamson mentioned that he had a cake with him and produced some ready-cut pieces of Dundee cake from his travelling bag, offering them around for all to eat. He had a piece, as did Percy and Mr. Bedbrook. Eventually, the topic of Dr. Lamson's visit to America came up, and he remembered he had some empty pill capsules that he had purchased over there. He showed them to Mr. Bedbrook, saying that he might find them useful for giving medicine to his pupils. Then, with both of them watching, he filled one of the capsules with sugar, taken from a bowl on the table, and gave it to Percy, saying, "Here, Percy, you are a champion pill taker. Take this." Percy took it and swallowed it. By then it was around 7:15 p.m. in the evening, and some 5 minutes later Dr. Lamson announced that he had to be leaving to catch the boat train for France. Mr. Bedbrook, who coincidentally was a director of the local railway company, said this wasn't necessary as the station was only a minute's walk away and the next boat train would not be leaving for almost an hour. Nevertheless, Dr. Lamson insisted on leaving, made his farewells, pausing only to tell Mr. Bedbrook that he thought Percy looked ill and was not long for this world. And so it turned out, because about 7:30, so just 15 minutes, less than 15 minutes after Dr. Lamson had departed, Percy began to complain of heartburn. He then started vomiting, and by 11:30 he was dead. Chemical analysis of the contents and of the stomach and the vomit revealed traces of an alkaloid poison called aconite, sometimes called aconitine or aconita. At the time, aconite was still a relatively unknown quantity, although it is now recognised as one of the fastest acting poisons in the world. In fact, it's sometimes called the queen of all poisons. The inhabitants of the Aleutian Islands used to coat it on their spears and use it to kill whales, while the Japanese use it to kill bears. And it occurs in a lot of products, including a plant called monkshood, wolfsbane, and it's so toxic that in 2014 a gardener from Hampshire in England suffered multiple organ failure merely by brushing against a wolfsbane plant in a greenhouse. Apparently, when he was taken to hospital, his condition was so desperate, doctors thought he was suffering from Ebola. Anyway, I say, this was the poison Dr. Hampson used on his poor brother-in-law. The police, naturally, were called in, and looking around, they could find no trace of aconite in the sugar or anywhere else. Therefore, it was thought the poison had been administered in the Dundee cake. The police case against Dr. Lamson was further strengthened when a London pharmacist who had read about the case reported that Dr. George Lamson of Bournemouth had purchased 2 grains of aconite. To everyone's surprise, Dr. Lamson returned from Paris on December the 8th and offered to help the police with their inquiries. This gesture was not as magnanimous as it might seem, as apparently he only had a few shillings left to his name. Dr. Lamson's assistance resulted in his arrest, and in March the following year he was put on trial. Even after a 2-day speech by the defence, which according to contemporary reports was terribly moving, the jury only took half an hour to decide that Lamson was guilty and that he had murdered Percy for the inheritance. Lamson was sentenced to death, the trial judge remarking that it had been a cruel, base and treacherous crime. Surprisingly, his friends and wife remained loyal to him and immediately began a campaign, both in this country and America, to assemble material to establish evidence of his insanity. Insanity is a defence in British law. And At this point that the then American President Chester Arthur, became involved, writing to the Home Secretary to ask for time before the execution so that if any evidence could be gathered, there'd be time to still do it. Various evidence was collected and dispatched, some of it saying that Dr. Lamson had a Jekyll and Hyde side to his character. But it did no good, and although the execution was postponed, it was to no avail, and on the morning of April the 28th, 1882, Dr. George Lamson was hanged for his crime. I mentioned a red herring, and the red herring really is how did the poison be delivered. It was quite clear that Dr. Lamson had the poison in his possession, but was it somehow coated and impregnated in the capsule that he filled with sugar and gave to Percy, or had he somehow managed to ensure that one slice of the cake contained the poison, but not the slice he or the school headmaster consumed? We'll never know. Time for some more royal news. Now, last week we were struck with a case of bad timing in our story about UFOs and Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, because when we scripted and recorded the show, he was still alive. But when most of you got to hear the show, he had shrugged off his mortal coil and gone to join the choir eternal. To be honest, we, like pretty much everyone else in the UK, thought he'd live on for years and at least would make a 100 and receive a telegram from the Queen. By way of explanation, it used to be a tradition in the UK that everyone who reached the age of 100 received a telegram of congratulations from the Queen. We don't have telegrams anymore, but you do still get a birthday card from Her Majesty. Anyway, apologies for anyone who was offended by the timing of the story, but it was due to circumstances beyond our control. We have no influence over the Grim Reaper. And just to compound matters, here are two more curious stories about the late Duke of Edinburgh. Did you know that on the island of Tarna, the Duke of Edinburgh is worshipped as a god? Now, Tarna is a small volcanic island, about 25 miles long, in the Coral Sea part of the South Pacific. It's now part of the island nation-state of Vanuatu. I think it's Vanuatu. It seems to be a variation of the cargo cults that swept through many South Pacific islands in the post-World War II years. The islanders say Philip was a king who sailed past Tarna in a uniform of silver and gold, together with his wife, Queen Lisbeth, in pidgin English. He apparently pointed out the rock to her, that's the island of Tarna, and said, "I am from Tarna, and one day I will leave you and return. I am coming back to that rock, and when I put my foot on it, mature carver roots will spring from the ground, old men will become young again, and there will be no more sickness or death." Although the Duke never set foot on Tarna during his lifetime, although he did go on an official visit to Vanuatu in 1974, just before the area gained independence, there has been contact between the islanders and the Duke. He sent them a signed photograph in 1978, and they, in return, sent him a nenai, a club that is used to kill pigs. The Duke, wearing a suit and tie, then posed for another photograph with the club in the Buckingham Palace grounds, and that in turn was sent to Tarna, where it is apparently still a cherished possession. Then, in 2007, so 30 years later, several Tarna tribal leaders on a visit to London met the Duke at Windsor Castle, where they presented gifts, more photographs were exchanged, and asked if he would ever return to Tarna. His reply, as reported by the tribesmen later, was somewhat cryptically, "When it turns warm, I will send a message." Whether the islanders will continue to revere the Duke after his death remains to be seen. For our second story, the Duke has a walk-on part in the creation of the UK's first computer misuse laws aimed at dealing with hackers. The story begins in 1984 when two British journalists, Robert Shifreen and Steve Gold, were investigating the Prestel View data system. This was one of the many precursors of the modern internet, although all communication speeds were via dial-up lines at 1200 bps download and 75 bps upload speeds. Today we'd call Shifreen and Gold white hat hackers, as they were more interested in finding and reporting security issues than hacking systems for personal gain. Anyway, they believed Prestel had inadequate security, something British Telecom, the developers of Prestel, refused to accept. One day, Shifreen was surfing the Prestel system and he stumbled across a live Prestel account that's login details were displayed and had a username of 2222222222. Anyway, 10 twos, and a password of, wait for it, 1234. It turned out it belonged to Prince Philip, and, so legend has it, Shifreen typed in the message, "Hello Phil, how is Liz?" and then notified British Telecom that their secure system wasn't quite as secure as they might think. Now, no doubt British Telecom would have probably liked to have hushed up the whole affair, but they had an incandescent Duke of Edinburgh to deal with, and so Shifreen and Gold were arrested. But what could they be charged with, as at that time the UK had no specific anti-hacking laws on the statute books? In the past, some people had been charged with an obscure clause of the Theft Act that made it a criminal offence to abstract electricity. This was aimed at people who were fiddling their electricity meters so they could getting more juice than they were paying for. However, in the Prestel case, the charges were under the Forgery and Counterfeiting Act, the logic being that entering someone else's password into a computer login is pretty much the same as entering someone else's signature on a forged cheque. Shifreen and Gold were convicted, but they appealed and were acquitted. And the acquittal was upheld in a subsequent appeal by the prosecution to the Supreme Court, or House of Lords as it still was called in those days. The judge's view was that using anti-forgery laws was inappropriate, as it was bending the law for purposes it was never originally meant to encompass. The result was Parliament went on to pass the Computer Misuse Act of 1990, which introduced the UK's first hacking laws. So, farewell then, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, a South Pacific island god, and the inadvertent godfather of computer hacking laws in the UK. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you for listening in. Please join me again next week for more weird tales in weird times. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, folklore, and the paranormal. You can keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Goodbye.